Hello and welcome to another video. In this one we're going to be looking at our domain and range. Now this one's going to be a little bit longer of a video, so if you are able to print the notes and follow along, that is going to be best. So first we got is a definition of domain and range. So for domain it says this is the set of all possible values for the independent variable. Okay, and independent variable, this is going to have some synonyms. So the domain, it could be called the input, it could be called the first element, and I'll kind of write out what that means. So if you had, say, a set of brackets and you had some points in there, okay, the first one, that is the first element. It can also be called the independent variable. We talked about that in our last video, which another word for that is the manipulated variable. And for these, we can also call them x values. The first point, we're going to always use a x, and then the second point, which we're going to see here down below, we will use a y. Okay, so that gets us into our range. The range is very similar to domain. It's just kind of the dependent or the second variable. So it is the set of all possible values for the dependent variable, and then dependent variable has some different synonyms or some different names. It's also called the output, the second element. So again, if I had my set of brackets, put my comma in between, that second coordinate there, or second element, that is the range. It is also the dependent or responding variable. Those two mean the same. And then again, can be the y value. So second term, we always use y. So there's a number of ways that we can represent the domain and the range. Some of these we're going to use more often than other ones. So for the first one, for A, we could use words. So we're literally just going to write out in words what the domain or range is. The second one there is a number line. So you're going to draw a number line, something like this. You'll have arrows on each side, and you'll have some points on there. Maybe it goes from 0, 1, 2, and so on. Okay, and then goes on to the negative side. Something simple like that. And then there's going to be kind of different points that we're going to draw on here. So just for a quick example, you could have something like this, and there's going to be like some shading on there. It's going to look something like that. Okay, we'll see some actual examples. The next one there is a list, and a list, you basically just write it out as a comma separated list. So you just put like 5, 6, 8, you just write them out. But this is only used for discrete data, because imagine if I told you to write the numbers from 0 to 1. Okay, now there's a lot of numbers actually from 0 to 1. You could have 0, you could have 0.1, you could have 0.001, and it could just keep going and going and going. You could have 0.5. There's an infinite amount of numbers from 0 to 1. So you can't use it for continuous sets. You only want to use it for discrete. And remember, discrete were dots. So it could only be like just 0, just a 1, just a 2. Whereas when it's continuous, you're trying to write all of the numbers in between there. It would be impossible to do. It would take forever. So I'm just going to write for discrete. This was when we had the dots on our graph. Okay, so not continuous. Then we have our set notation. And for set notation, we're going to use some curly type brackets that look like this. And the way I remember those is I try to think of that curly bracket as kind of like one part of an S that looks like an S, and then I draw another kind of backwards S, and it makes my curly bracket. Okay, so one kind of S and then another S. So that's just how I remember that one. And then the last way is interval notation, and this one uses some different brackets to indicate different types of intervals. So if you use square brackets, and we're going to see examples of these, that means that the end number is going to be included. So the way I remember that is that if you had kind of a square bracket like that, if you removed that middle part of the bracket there, we would get this. And then if I just kind of moved these two together, I would get an equal sign. Okay, so it means it is included, it is equal to it, it is allowed. Okay, so that's how I remember that one. Kind of the opposite of the square brackets is these round brackets, and that one is the exact opposite. It's when that end number is not included, so you don't actually include the point. Maybe it's like an 8 and you got a round bracket around it like this, that means you're not actually going to be including the 8. And again, we'll see some examples where we use this. And then the last thing we need to know for interval notation is this infinity symbol. So it's kind of like an 8 turned sideways. And for this one, it means that there is no endpoint. If you went to infinity, that means you're not stopping. There is no endpoint. So those are all of our ways to express domain and range. Now we're going to get into some examples here. So it says find the domain and range for each of these relations. And we're going to be told in each one a different type of how we're going to write it. So the first one here is our relation. It's just a set of ordered pairs. So what we're going to do is we're first going to write out the domain. So we're going to say the domain is, and then we're going to list out the domain. Now remember, the domain was the first element in our points. So it was all of these points right here. So it was the 1, the 0, the 3, the 5, the -3. So we are going to write those out, but whenever you are listing out the domain, you want to write it from smallest to biggest. So I'm just going to write that up here. Okay, so now that we know that, we're just going to write these out. So the smallest number there was a -3, so we got -3. And then next we had a 0, then we had a 1, then we had a 3, and then lastly we had a 5. So that is our domain. It's all of those points. Next we're going to do the range. And for this I'm going to use a different color just so we can kind of see the difference. So the range is, and these are going to be all of the second points. So it's the 2, the 5, the 8, the 9, and the 9 there again. Now with this one we had a repeating number. We had the 9 repeated twice. So I'm just going to write another hint here on the side. Do not write repeating numbers twice. Okay, so we don't need to write it twice, we can just write it once. And again, we're going to go from smallest to largest. So our smallest number was a 2, a 5, then an 8, and then the 9. So that would be our range. Okay, so that first one is now complete. Then we can look at number 2 there, and this one we're given a graph. And for this, we are going to use a list to describe our domain and range. So first, let's start with our domain. I'm just going to use the letter D, and you guys can do this as well. Every time you do domain and range, D is for domain, R will be for range. Now for these ones with a graph, what I do with these is I use a little trick, and it's my flashlight trick. And I pretend like I'm basically shining a flashlight, and it will tell me what the domain is just from the shadows that I get. So that's what makes it really simple. So I'm just going to write for the graph, you're going to use a flashlight trick. And for domain, what you want to do is you want to shine the flashlight down. Okay, when you get to the range, so range, what you're going to do is you're going to flash the light from the right. Okay, and it makes it easy because range goes with R, right, and then D goes with domain, and that's down. So back to doing the domain here, we're going to pretend like we have a flashlight pointing down. It's going to be sending light from the top here. We're going to have light going all the way across the top, and then that light is going to come, right, and it's going to hit these points, and then that point blocks the light, and then we're going to get a shadow here on the wall. Okay, so there's going to be a shadow right there. This light is going to come and it's going to go all the way through so we don't get a shadow there. Okay, all of these lines, no shadow, but then all of a sudden here we hit that point and this is going to come down and then we get a shadow. Okay, so there's only certain spots where, like here, hits, comes down, so this is going to be a shadow. So I literally pretend like I'm flashing a light. So I'm also going to have a shadow here at the bottom, and then here the light is going to come and it hits this first point, so it's already blocked, and then the second point, it's still already blocked, but I'm still going to get a shadow down here at the end of the wall. So there's still going to be a shadow here. So now that I know these points here, that is my domain. So I can see this one's at 0, this one's at 1, that one's at 2, then we're at -1, and that one's at -2. So I can just write out my domain, and we're using a list. So a list, you just write them out. So we got -2, a 1, a 0, a 1, and then a 2. Okay, and then this one too also uses curly brackets. Okay, so now that we're done the domain, we're next going to do the range, and for that we're going to use an R. So we'll start with our open curly bracket, and then again, remember, R is for the range, and we're going to go from the right side. So we're going to shine our flashlight over from here. The light's going to come, it's going to hit these points, and only wherever there's a point, right, is there ever going to be a shadow on the wall. So all of these points we're going to hit, and then they're going to create shadows. So there's a shadow there, shadow there. Here we're going to get a shadow, and then from that second point, doesn't matter if there's another point behind it, there's still a shadow. There will be a shadow, and this last one here, also a shadow there. So it's going to be at 1, 2, 3, and then it goes 4, 5, skips those ones, and then it's at 6, and then 7. So those are the numbers I need to write out: a 1, 2, 3, and a 6, and a 7. So 1, 2, 3, 6, and 7. So if we use that flashlight trick, it makes these graph ones a little bit easier. With the next one here, number 3, we're going to use interval notation, and again, it's on a graph, so I can use the flashlight trick. So first, let's do our domain. So I'm going to shine my flashlight down, and something to note with these lines here, they have arrows on the end. That means that that line continues for forever. So it just keeps going and going and going. Same with on this side, we got an arrow, so it just keeps going and going. So if I shined a flashlight, okay, imagine shining a flashlight from up top here, okay, all the light that I'm going to shine, all of it is going to hit this graph, and none of it is going to go through. So what I'm going to get is I'm going to get a massive shadow everywhere down here at the bottom, because none of the light can get by that line. So our domain for interval notation, remember interval notation was the one with the different types of curly brackets. So it's this. So we could have, say, square brackets, round brackets, and we might have to use the infinity symbol, and that meant there was no end point. So if I look at these, okay, this one here, that arrow, it just keeps going. That means there's no end point. So it's just going to keep going to infinity. Same with on this side. It's just going to keep going and going. So that's going to go to negative infinity. So my domain, it's going to go from negative infinity all the way to infinity. And I can't include those endpoints, so I need to put round brackets, because infinity cannot be contained. It just keeps going and going. So there's our domain. Next we got our range, and range we're going to shine our flashlight from the right. So we're shining our flashlight, it's going to hit this point. Here we're going to get a shadow on the wall, and then anytime I shine a flashlight above that, right, all of this light is going to get blocked, and we're going to get a big shadow over here on the wall. And it's just going to keep going up, because as I shine the flashlight up here, all of that is being blocked by this line that just kept going up. So all of the light is blocked up there. If I would shine my flashlight from down here though, that's not going to create a shadow. So there's going to be no shadow in this region here. There's only a shadow above that. So it started here and it just kept going up. So that was at 0, and it's going to go up until infinity. So we're going to go from 0 to infinity. Remember, infinity can't be contained, always has to have a round bracket. And then for the 0 here, I can see that I do have a shadow on my wall. So I am going to put a square bracket. That means there is a shadow, it is contained, it is in the range. Okay, our next one here, we got kind of a oval looking shape on there, and here we're doing our set notation. Remember, set notation, this was the curly bracket one. So let's do our domain here first. So again, flashlight shining down. So I shine my light, it's all coming down, and all of this light is going to get hit and blocked. So right from here, hits, it's going to make a shadow. all the way to this side, right, it would come down, hit, and we're going to get a shadow. And then anywhere in between that, right, from here to here, right there, all of that light is getting blocked up here. So we're going to have a shadow down here at the bottom. Okay, so this goes from, this was at 2, so that was as high as 2, and it went as low as -1, -2, -3, -4. So this is -4. So to write our set notation, you're going to first write an X, and in front of that you're going to have a curly bracket, and then you're going to write a vertical line like that. Now what that vertical line means is given that. So what we're going to do is we're giving some X values, and we're going to list them here. So we went from a -4 to a 2, so I'm going to write that over here. It goes from a -4 to a 2. And then what you're going to put in between is an X, because this is the X values. And then you're going to put an inequality sign. And then depending on what we have over here, if we have solid dots, that means we include those points. So in order to include them, we have to equal them. So I need to put equal signs over here with each of these numbers. Okay, so if we had an open dot, we wouldn't have that equal sign there. But if we do have a solid dot like these ones, we have to have an equal sign right here and here. And then the very last thing, you're going to put X, and then this fancy E, and then this fancy R. And all that means is X is an element of, and then the R means the real numbers. So fancy E means is an element of. And then the R, it just stands for real numbers, and that's basically any kind of number that you can think of. Okay, so X is any number that you can think of from -4 up to 2, and it can include -4 and 2. So next we'll do our range, and for that one we're going to do our flashlight from the right. So we're going to shine our flashlight. It's going to hit right here, and then we're going to get a shadow on the wall right there. So that was as high as 3. And then all this other light is going to hit, and it's all going to be blocked on there. So we're not going to have a light hitting the wall, and it's going to go as low as right here. It'll hit, and then we're going to get a shadow on the wall. So that is as low as -3. So it went from -3 to 3, and there's a shadow everywhere in between that. So to write this one, because this is the range, we're using Y.
So it's Y is an element of.
And we went from -3 to 3. Remember, always got to go from smallest to biggest. And then put your Y in the middle and put your inequalities. And then we included both of those. We had solid dots on both of them, so we need to include them. We got to put equal signs. And then again, just put the Y is an element of the real numbers, and then the last curly bracket. So this Y is an element of the real numbers, and this X is an element of the real numbers. That should be on every single set notation question that you guys get. So moving from there, we got some more examples. Here again, it says find the domain and the range, but here we're going to do it in a few different ways. So for number 5, we got a line. Now this point right here, that solid point, it's filled in, not like this one where it's kind of not filled in. This solid point means you include that point. Okay, it is filled in. Here, when it doesn't have a solid point and it has kind of like a hollow dot, that means it doesn't actually include that point. Okay, so there's actually not a point right there. It goes right up to it and it gets really, really close, but there's no point actually right there. Okay, so again, for domain, we can do the flashlight down. So I'm going to shine my flashlight down, and then it's going to create shadows. So at this point, it's going to come, it's going to hit, and then that's going to create a shadow. So I'm going to have a shadow on the wall here. Same with any other light that came and hit here. All of this is going to be a shadow region. So all of this here, this is all going to be shadowed. Okay, but at the end, if I were to shine a light right here, and I had a pinhole, I would go through the pinhole, and then there wouldn't be a shadow on the wall. There would be light on the wall. So I got to do kind of an open dot there. There wouldn't be a shadow. So this went to 3. That was at 3 over. And then the other one, this was -4 here. So I go -5, -6. So this went as low as -6. So it went from -6 to 3. Now to do a number line, just draw a simple little line, put arrows on the end, and then put the 2 points that are at the end on your graph that were important. So you're going to put a -6, and you're going to put a 3. Okay, and then just mimic exactly what you have down here. So on 3, I have an open dot, so you're going to put an open dot on that one. And then on the -6, I had a solid dot. So I'm going to do a solid dot. Okay, and then in between, we had the shading going from one to the other, because that was all shadow. So I'm going to shade on my line. Just make sure you do it thick enough that it's easy to see. So it goes from -6 up to 3, but then we got an open dot because it actually doesn't include the 3. Okay, so I'm just going to write up here at the top, solid dot. This is going to include the point. Okay, and then another way to think of that is it has a shadow. And then if you have an open dot, that means it excludes the point. And there's no shadow. Okay, so let's finish off the number line there. We're on to the range. I'm just going to draw my number line with my arrows. And range, we're shining our flashlight from the right. I'm going to erase what I had here just so we can see it a little bit clearer. So we're going to shine our flashlight from the right. So it's going to come. That's going to make a shadow because we can't go through that point. And then all of our other light hitting this line, that's all going to make a shadow. Okay, but when we get down to this point, if I shine my light, it's going to go through that point, and then I have light hitting the wall, so there isn't a shadow there. So I'm going to go as high as 5 and as low as -4, but there's no shadow at -4. So let's put our points. It went as high as 5 and as low as -4, but we didn't include the -4, so open dot, and we did include the 5, so solid dot. And then just draw your shading or like your shadow in between that. So now that we have that, we can move on to our next one, which is a list. Now list, we said, wasn't good for something that was continuous. And this line that we have, it is continuous. There's no gaps. It's not dots. So we can't actually do a list. So it had to be discrete. It had to have dots only on the graph. For set notation, remember S, that was the curly bracket one, so I'm going to start my curly bracket. Okay, and then we put X, given that, and then we're going to write it went from -6 to 3, so -6 up to 3, put your X in the middle, and then put your 2 inequality signs in there. And then on the 6, it actually equaled the 6, so we can put an equal sign, but we can't put an equal sign with this one because it didn't actually equal the 3, it had an open dot there. Okay, and then lastly, just X is an element of the real numbers, and then close your bracket. So next for our range, we got the curly bracket, and then Y, given that, and we went from -4 all the way up to 5, so I'm going to go from -4 up to 5, and then put your inequality signs and your Y in the middle. And then we only ever equaled the 5. There was a solid dot there, so I can equal the 5, but it never was actually at -4. It was an open dot, so can't put an equal sign on that one. And then lastly, Y is an element of the real numbers. So set notation's done. Now for interval notation. And for interval notation, we went from -6 up to 3, and we included the -6. We have to have a solid dot, but we didn't include the 3, so we have to have a round bracket. And then lastly, for our range, we went from -4 up to 5, and we included the 5 over there, so we got to have a solid bracket on the 5, but we didn't include the -4, so we got to have a round bracket on the -4. So now that we've seen that one, if you wanted to try to do number 6 here by yourself, you could try to do that one. So going through number 6, we can see with this one we have an arrow at the end, so that just means that this line just keeps going on and on and on. So doing our number line, I'm going to draw my line here first, put my arrows, and we're going to do our flashlight, so we're going to shine our flashlight down. Now at this point it's going to go through that and we're not going to have a shadow, so that's going to be open dot, but all of these other points, that is all going to create a shadow on our wall, and it's just going to keep going because this line just keeps going. So it's going to go from this point here was at -2, and it just keeps going and going and going. So to represent that on our number line, we're going to put -2. We're going to put an open dot because it didn't include it, and then we're going to shade on our number line. It just keeps going and going. And we draw an arrow to say that it just continues. Just going to erase these lines and then do our range. So range, we're now shining our flashlight from the right. So at this low point here, it's going to go through there, and this is not going to have a shadow. But every point above that, these are all going to hit the line, and then we're not going to have any light on the wall. This is all going to be a shadow region, and it's just going to keep going up and up because this line just keeps going up and up, and it just keeps blocking more light. So let's draw our number line, put our arrows, and then we started as low as -3. So start as low as -3, and then it didn't include that -3, so open dot, and then it just kept going upwards. And it continued, so draw a arrow to say it just keeps going. Next we have the list, and the list, again, remember, can only use that if we have dots. So again, I can't use the list. Then we got set notation, so that was curly brackets, and then we got X for our domain, so X given that. So for our domain, we went as low as -2, and then it just kept going upwards. So we're going to start at -2, and then we got X there. And X was greater than 2. We had all of these points that were greater than 2, but we didn't include 2 because we had an open dot there. So open dot means we can't have an equal sign here. It just has to be greater than 2. And then don't forget to put X is an element of the real numbers. Again, that should be on every single question. Now we got a range for our set notation, so curly bracket and put the Y. And that went from -3, and then it just kept going up. So we're going to be going from -3, and then our Y, and we are greater than -3. And we don't put the equal sign here because we didn't include the -3, right? It was an open dot, so we can't put an equal sign there. It's just the inequality. And then don't forget to put Y is an element of the real numbers. And then last one, interval notation. So our domain, we went from -2, and then there was no upper bound, so it went from -2 all the way to infinity. Remember, can't include infinity, so round bracket. And we couldn't include the -2 either, so that also has to have a round bracket. For the range, it went from -3, and it kept going up forever, so we got to put infinity, goes to infinity. Can't include infinity. And again, we didn't include the 3 over here, so we can't include it here. Has to have a round bracket. So 6 is done. We can move on to number 7 here again. And if you wanted to try it first, you could try to do it first. So for our domain, we're going to be shining that flashlight down. It's going to hit the graph here at all these points. So it's going to hit, and then that is going to create a shadow. So there's going to be a shadow there on the wall that went as high as 5. And then all these other ones, again, those are all going to make shadows. So we're going to have shadows going all the way down. And then at this point, it's going to go here. It's going to go through that pinhole. It's going to keep going, but then it hits this point, and it won't get through that point right there. So we're going to have a shadow coming, and we have a shadow on the wall. So it went from 0 all the way up to 5. So let's do our number line. And we went from 0 up to 5, and we had solid dots on both of those. We included them, and then we got to draw our shadow or our shading in between. And maybe with this one, I'm just going to continue to do the domain with each one. So when we get to the list here, trying to do the domain for that one, remember we can't do it if it's not dots, if it's not discrete. So again, we can't do anything with that one. Our set notation for domain though, we have x given that, and then it went from 0 to 5. So we go from 0 up to 5, put your x in the middle and your inequalities, and we included both of them. So equal sign on both of them, and then put x is an element of the real numbers. Last curly bracket, our starting curly bracket. And then lastly, for interval notation, went from 0 to 5, and then it included both, so we got to put solid brackets on both. So that was for the domain. Now I'm just going to do the range. So the range, we're shining our flashlight from the right, okay, hitting all these points. It's going to go through this point, right? So when it gets to here, there's not going to be a shadow, so that can't be filled in. But all these other points, it's going to hit, and it's going to create a shadow all the way down. And then even here, when it tries to go through this point, it hits it, so we end up getting a shadow on the wall. So it went from 2 all the way up to 7. So on our number line, it's going to go from 2 to 7, and it includes the 2. We had a solid dot there, but it does not include the 7. So open dot there, and then draw your shadow or your shading on the line. For our set notation, we got y given that, and then put our curly bracket, and it went from 2 to 7, so 2 to 7. Put y in the middle and our inequalities, and then it didn't include the 7, so we can't put an equal sign there, but it did include the 2, so we can put an equal sign with that one. And then just put y is an element of the real numbers. And then lastly, interval notation went from a 2 to a 7. Didn't include the 7, so round bracket, but it did include the 2, so we have to put a solid bracket. Okay, so that took a bit of time, but as you guys do more of these, you're going to get better. You're going to get a little bit faster. So the last thing here we have now is a word problem, so it's more of an applied type question. So it says a Ferris wheel has a radius of 22 centimeters, and the bottom of the wheel is going to be 3 centimeters above the ground, and it takes 10 seconds to complete one revolution. So for it to do one whole circle, that is going to be 10 seconds. Then it says the graph shows the height of a chair during 2 rotations of the wheel. So we're going to have this chair, it's going to start at the bottom, it's going to go around the Ferris wheel, and then it's going to do that a second time, so 2 rotations. So I'm just going to draw a little picture over here of what our Ferris wheel might look like. So we're going to have the ground. Okay, then we're going to have some structure that is kind of holding it upwards. And then we're going to have our actual kind of Ferris wheel part. So there's our Ferris wheel. And we knew that the radius, remember the radius goes from the center to the outer part. So our radius, if I drew it down like this, that is 22 centimeters. And if it went up, that is also going to be 22 centimeters. And another measurement they told us is that it was 3 centimeters above the ground. So this little length down here at the very, very bottom there, that is 3 centimeters above the ground. So our total height of this entire Ferris wheel, it's going to be 3 centimeters plus 22 plus another 22. And when we add all 3 of those up, we're going to get 47 centimeters. So it's 47 centimeters tall. Questions. So now we got a picture of what our Ferris wheel at least looks like. Just to describe what this graph is, we got our time on the horizontal axis. Time always has to go on the bottom there. And then we got height in centimeters, and that is on the vertical axis. And time is represented in minutes. So that's going to be kind of a problem because we were given this in seconds. So we're going to have to convert one to the other. Now, just to show what this graph is, we're starting at the low point. That was at the low point of the Ferris wheel, 3 centimeters. And then we go up, reach the max, and then we come down, and then it just kind of restarts. So we start at 3, we're going to go up, reach our max, then we came back down in our height. And this is as time is moving forward. We can't ever go backwards on our graph. And then again, we go up, reach the max height, and then we come back down again. And this would just keep continuing over and over for however many times we went around on the wheel. So part A, what are the values of A, B, C, and D? And then we're going to label these on the graph. So first let's start at A. So A is up here, and I can see that is that maximum height that we had on our graph. And we had written over here, our max height that we got up to was 47 centimeters. So A is going to be 47 centimeters there. Then for B, that's the low point on our graph, and the lowest you would ever get on the Ferris wheel would be right here, and that's 3 centimeters off the ground. So this is going to be 3. Then we got C. C is on the horizontal axis here, and your time, it's going to be starting at 0 and then moving forward, so that is a 0. And then for D, that is at the very end of these 2 rotations that we did, or 2 revolutions. So each of them took 10 seconds, right? So this first one, that was 10 seconds to do that. And then the second one was another 10 seconds. So total, we had 20 seconds. So this is going to be 20 seconds to get to the end, but this is in minutes. So we got to convert 20 seconds into minutes. And I know that there are 60 seconds in 1 minute. So the way we can convert this is just put 60 seconds in the bottom, because I know 60 seconds is in 1 minute. And I got to put it in this order with seconds on the bottom, because seconds and seconds will cancel, just like if you had, say, 2 over 2, 2 and 2 would cancel. It's the same kind of thing, it's just they're seconds instead. So those 2 cancel, and then all I have is 20 times this by 1, divide by 60. So when I do that, you get 0.3 repeating. Okay, and this is now minutes, because that's the only thing left over. So this is going to be 0.3 repeating. So part A is done. Part B now says, what is the domain and range of the graph? And we're going to do it in words, number line, interval notation, and then set notation. So in words, I could say for my domain, remember domain is the horizontal, so that is the time. So it went from 0 minutes all the way up to 0.3 repeating minutes. So let's write something like that. Okay, so the time begins at 0 minutes and goes up to 0.3 repeating minutes. And if it didn't say how long you wrote it for, it would just keep going and going and going. So it depends on how many times you actually went around. For the range, we went from as low as 3 and we went up to as high as 47. So let's write that. So the words one is now all done. Then we can move to our number line. So let's draw our number line for domain here first. Draw our arrows. And we're going to go from 0 to 0.3. So go from 0 to 0.3 repeating. Okay, and both of those times, if we did like the shadow down thing, both of those times are going to be included. So we're going to draw solid dots at the ends and got a shade in between. And again, if you said that you just kept going on the ride, you would actually draw an arrow to say that you just kept continuing, but in this case we said we stopped. For range, let's draw our number line. And we went from 3 to 47. And we included both of those heights. We got to each of those heights, so we have to include those. They got to be solid dots. And then just draw your shading in between, because we were at all of the heights in between as well. So the first 2 are done. Then we can look at interval notation. So again, we went from 0 to 0.3 repeating, and we included both of those, so you gotta have the solid brackets. For the range, we went from 3 to 47, and again, we included both of those as well. We are at both of those heights. So interval notation is done. So lastly, set notation for domain. This was the time, so I'm gonna actually use the letter T. So we got curly bracket and then the given that. So T, the time, went from 0 all the way up to 0.3 3 repeating, then put your time, t in between, and then the inequalities, and we included both of those times. And then lastly, just put t is an element of the real numbers. And very lastly here now, the range, that was the height. Remember up here, height. So I'm going to use the letter h to represent height. So height, given that, and our curly bracket. And the height went from 3 all the way up to 47. Okay, and then I'm going to put my height in the middle. And we were at both of those heights, so you got to put equal signs on both of them, and then just put h is an element of the real numbers. So we're finally done that one. Last thing I'm just going to write here at the bottom is our homework. Okay, and then I'm just going to make a note of these. This one is going to be our day 1 homework, because it's going to be split into 2 days, and then this one is going to be our day 2 homework. So in day 1 you're doing page 301, 1 to 3, and then on our second day you're doing page 301, 4 to 6 and 8, and we're going to also have a handout sheet that we're going to be working on.